The channel was angry that morning, spitting foam against the hull of landing ship Tank 427 as it pitched through the darkness. Lieutenant James Holloway pressed his palm against the cold steel wall of the vessel, feeling the engine's rumble travel through his bones. Around him, 32 men sat in silence, their faces illuminated only by the dim red combat lights that painted everything the color of dried blood. 5 minutes! Someone shouted from above. James looked at the Sherman tank behind him, 30 tons of American steel that the Germans would never see coming. Intelligence said the Wehrmacht expected infantry, maybe some light artillery. They'd fortified the cliffs, positioned their machine guns to mow down soldiers as they stumbled through the surf. But tanks? Rolling off ships directly onto the beaches? The audacity of it bordered on madness. Beside him, Corporal Eddie Martinez checked his Thompson submachine gun for the 14th time. His hands shook, not from fear. James knew Eddie's courage, but from the cold Atlantic wind that seeped through every crack in the ship's armor. Eddie had been a mechanic in Detroit before the war, back when his biggest worry was whether the Tigers would win the pennant. Now he was responsible for keeping a 30-ton war machine running while men died around him. "You think it'll work, Lieutenant?" Eddie asked, his voice barely audible over the engines. "The floating tanks?" James thought about the DD Shermans, duplex drive tanks fitted with inflatable canvas screens and propellers, designed to swim to shore before dropping their flotation devices and becoming killing machines. He'd watched them during training, watched one sink when its screen collapsed, taking 4 men with it into the depths. "It'll work because it has to," James said. The ship lurched violently. Someone vomited. The smell of diesel fuel mixed with fierce sweat and salt water created an atmosphere so thick James could taste it. He pulled out a photograph from his breast pocket, Sarah and little Tommy, taken last summer in their backyard in Pennsylvania. Tommy was holding a wooden sword, pretending to fight dragons. Sarah was laughing, her head thrown back, her auburn hair catching the sunlight. 2 minutes. The tank crew was already mounting up. Sergeant Bill Tucker, the tank commander, was a leathery Texan who'd fought in North Africa and Sicily. He'd seen friends incinerated, watched tanks brew up with men trapped inside. But he climbed into the turret with the same grim determination he showed every morning. Private First Class Raymond Chun, the driver, crossed himself 3 times before disappearing into the hull. Raymond was from San Francisco, had enlisted the day after Pearl Harbor despite his family's internment camp fears. "My country," he'd said simply when asked why. The loader was Johnny Fitzgerald from Boston, a kid who looked 16 but swore he was 20. His brother had died at Kasserine Pass. Johnny carried that death like a stone in his chest, never spoke about it. But James saw it in his eyes every time the guns fired. The gunner, Frank Morrison, was the oldest at 34. A career soldier who joined during the Depression when the Army offered 3 meals a day and a purpose. Frank could put a 75mm shell through a window at 1,000 yards. He'd proven it in Tunisia. 1 minute. Ramp down in 60 seconds. The ship's engines changed pitch. Through the steel walls, James heard the thunder of naval bombardment. The big guns from the battleships and cruisers, hurling shells the size of Volkswagens at the German fortifications. Each explosion made the ship vibrate. The bombardment was supposed to soften the defenses, turn the Atlantic wall into rubble. But James had learned in Sicily that shells and bombs never killed all the enemy. There were always survivors, always men in concrete bunkers waiting with machine guns and mortars, waiting to turn the beach into an abattoir. 30 seconds. The ramp mechanism groaned. James felt his stomach tighten. He thought about his father, who'd fought in the Argonne Forest in the Great War. His father never talked about it, but sometimes James would find him sitting in the dark, staring at nothing, his hands trembling. Now James understood why. The ramp began to lower. Dawn light, gray and weak, spilled into the ship's hold. With it came the sound of war. The crack of rifles, the chatter of machine guns, the crump of mortars, and underneath it all, the screaming. Always screaming. "Go! Go! Go!" The Sherman's engine roared to life, belching blue smoke. Raymond released the brake, and the tank lurched forward. James ran alongside it, his boots clanging on the metal ramp. Then they were out, dropping into chest-deep water that was shockingly cold despite the June date. The beach appeared through the smoke and spray, Omaha Beach, though it looked nothing like the aerial photographs. Bodies floated in the surf. Burning vehicles sent black pillars into the sky. Obstacles, steel hedgehogs and wooden stakes, jutted from the sand like broken teeth, and on the cliffs above, muzzle flashes. The Germans were very much alive. The Sherman hit solid ground, water cascading off its hull. The canvas flotation screen collapsed with a wet slap. Through the chaos, James saw something that made his blood freeze. A German PaK-40 anti-tank gun, positioned in a concrete bunker halfway up the bluff, traversing toward them. Tank. Bunker. 11 o'clock. 300 yards. James screamed into his radio. The Sherman's turret swung with mechanical precision. Frank Morrison had already seen it. The 75mm gun fired, the concussion slapping James's chest even through the tank's armor. The shell struck the bunker's embrasure, sending concrete chips flying, but the PaK-40 survived. It fired back. The German shell screamed past, missing the Sherman by 3 feet and exploding in the water behind them. The spray drenched James, salt water burning his eyes. He pressed himself against the tank side, using it as mobile cover while returning fire from the bunker kicked up sand geysers around his boots. Load high explosive. Hit that bunker. Bill Tucker's voice crackled through the radio, steady despite the hell erupting around them. James looked down at the beach. More LSTs were disgorging their cargo. Not just tanks but also infantry, engineers, medics. Men waded through water turned pink with blood, struggling under the weight of their equipment. Some made it. Many didn't. The Germans had pre-sighted every meter of this beach and had spent 4 years preparing for this moment. But the Germans hadn't prepared for tanks. Another Sherman roared past, its tracks churning through wet sand. Then another. Within minutes, a dozen armored vehicles were pushing up the beach, their 75mm guns hammering the German positions. Each tank became a magnet, drawing fire away from the infantry struggling through the obstacles. The Sherman beside James fired again. This time, the shell penetrated the bunker's firing slit. Secondary explosions followed. Ammunition cooking off, men dying in an instant of fire and overpressure. The PaK-40 fell silent. Moving up. Raymond's voice came through the intercom. The tank surged forward, climbing the gentle slope that led from the waterline to the seawall. James jogged beside it, joined by Eddie Martinez and a handful of infantry who'd realized the tanks offered the best chance of survival. Together, they formed an improvised combined arms team, the tanks providing firepower and protection, the infantry spotting targets and protecting the tanks from German soldiers with Panzerfaust rockets. A mortar round landed 10 yards away. James felt the concussion, felt shrapnel whine past his helmet. A soldier beside him, a kid from Iowa whose name James never learned, simply ceased to exist, there one moment and gone the next, leaving only a red mist. Jesus Christ, Eddie whispered. Keep moving, James shouted. If we stop, we die. The seawall loomed ahead, a concrete barrier 4 feet high that the Germans had built to stop exactly this kind of assault. Machine gun fire from a position to the right raked across the Sherman's armor, sparks flying as bullets ricocheted. The tank's coaxial machine gun returned fire, .30 caliber rounds chewing into the German position. Then they were at the wall. The Sherman couldn't climb it, but its presence provided cover. Infantry crowded behind it, catching their breath, checking their weapons. A Sergeant James didn't recognize was organizing Bangalore torpedoes, long tubes of explosive design to blow holes in the wall. We need 5 minutes, the sergeant shouted. You've got 3, Bill Tucker called down from the turret. Every Jerry from here to Berlin knows where we are. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. James helped position the Bangalore torpedoes. His hands were shaking now, adrenaline finally catching up with him. Around him, men were praying, crying, laughing hysterically. The human mind did strange things when pushed to its limits. The explosives detonated with a roar that momentarily drowned out even the naval bombardment. When the smoke cleared, a 20-foot gap gaped in the seawall. Beyond it, a dirt road led up the bluff toward the German fortifications. Through the gap! Move, move, move! Officers were shouting. The Sherman revved its engine and pushed through, widening the gap. Infantry flooded after it, spreading out, seeking cover in the cratered landscape beyond the beach. James went with them, his Thompson at his shoulder, scanning for targets. The first German he saw was a kid, maybe 17, stumbling from a collapsed foxhole with his hands up. His uniform was too large, his face gray with shock. James almost shot him, the muscle memory of training, the primal fear response. But Eddie grabbed his arm. "He's done," Eddie said quietly. They left the German for the MPs who would come behind them. There was no time for prisoners, not yet. The battle was still being won or lost with every passing second. The Sherman crested the bluff, and for the first time, James could see beyond the beach. The Norman countryside stretched before them. Hedgerows, fields, small stone villages with church spires reaching toward the gray sky. It looked peaceful, almost pastoral, except for the German tanks moving into position 300 yards away. Panzers! 2 o'clock. Frank Morrison's voice was ice-cold professional. James's stomach dropped. 2 Panzer IVs were traversing their turrets toward them, their long 75mm guns like accusing fingers. The Shermans were outgunned, out-armored. Everyone knew it. The only advantages they had were numbers and the element of surprise. The lead Panzer fired first. The shell struck the ground 5 yards in front of their Sherman, showering dirt and rocks across the glassy plate. Raymond immediately threw the tank into reverse, backing down the slope to use the terrain for cover. "Can't get a clean shot," Frank cursed. "Then we make one," Bill Tucker said. "Raymond, hard right, get us around that hedgerow. Eddie, you're with the lieutenant, we need infantry support. There'll be German soldiers with Panzerfausts in those hedges." James and Eddie dismounted while the Sherman maneuvered. They were joined by a dozen infantry, including a baby-faced lieutenant named Peterson who looked like he'd never shaved. Together, they pushed along the hedgerow, thick walls of earth and vegetation that the Normans had built over centuries to mark property lines. The hedgerows provided cover but also channeled movement, turning the countryside into a maze. A German machine gun opened up from a farmhouse 200 yards away. Bullets clipped through the foliage above their heads. Everyone hit the dirt. "Suppress that position," Peterson shouted. Rifles and Thompson submachine guns chattered. The German fire slackened but didn't stop. James could see the muzzle flash from a second-story window. "We need that tank," James said into his radio. "Little busy here," Bill Tucker replied. In the background, James heard the Sherman's gun fire, heard the clang of an enemy shell hitting armor. "Bazooka!" someone shouted. "We need a bazooka team." 2 soldiers ran forward with the tube-launched anti-tank weapon, but they never got into position. A German sniper, hidden somewhere in the farm complex, shot the loader through the throat. The man dropped without a sound, blood spurting. His partner dragged him back, but they all knew he was dead. "God damn it!" Peterson slammed his fist into the ground. "We can't stay here. We're sitting ducks." James thought fast. The farmhouse was stone, and would take too long to reduce with small arms. But the barn next to it, weathered wood, probably dry as kindling. "Eddie, you still got those incendiary grenades?" Eddie grinned despite the circumstances. "Never leave home without them, Lieutenant." They worked their way right, using the hedgerow for cover, until they were within throwing distance of the barn. German machine gun fire still chatted from the farmhouse, but the gunner couldn't depress his weapon enough to hit them here. "On 3, James said. 1, 2, 3. They threw simultaneously. The grenades arced through the air, crashing through the barn's windows. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the flame blossomed, yellow and hungry. The dry wood caught instantly. Within seconds, the entire barn was an inferno, flames leaping 30 feet into the air. The Germans in the farmhouse panicked. James could hear them shouting. Smoke was blowing directly into the house, and the heat must have been unbearable. They had two choices, burn or run. They ran. For soldiers burst from the back door, coughing, disoriented. The American infantry cut them down without mercy. War was not a place for mercy. With the farmhouse cleared, the advance continued. The Sherman had knocked out one Panzer IV. The other had retreated. But more German resistance awaited. Every hedgerow concealed another position. Every village was a fortress. The Wehrmacht had spent years fortifying Normandy, and they weren't giving it up without extracting a price in blood. By noon, James's unit had advanced less than a mile from the beach. They'd taken 30% casualties. The survivors were exhausted, running on adrenaline and fear, but they were inland. They'd broken through the Atlantic Wall, the supposedly impregnable fortress that Hitler had boasted would throw the Allies back into the sea. They'd done it because of the tanks. The Germans had never expected armor on the beaches, and had never prepared for it. Their anti-tank guns were positioned to cover roads and villages, not the beach itself. By the time they'd adjusted, the Shermans were already pushing inland, disrupting defensive plans, creating chaos. "Lieutenant," Eddie said, collapsing beside James behind a shot-up German half-track. "We actually did it. We're in France." James pulled out his canteen, took a long drink of tepid water that tasted like metal and victory. "We're in France," he agreed. "Now we just have to fight across the whole damn country." As the sun began its descent toward evening, casting long shadows across the bloodied Norman fields, the true scope of the Allied achievement became clear. Radio reports crackled through the command net. Utah Beach secure with relatively light casualties. British and Canadian forces pushing inland from Gold, Juno, and Sword. Even Omaha, which had nearly failed, was now firmly in Allied hands. And everywhere, the tanks had made the difference. General Raymond Miller stood in a temporary command post established in a captured German bunker, studying maps spread across a table still warm from enemy occupation. He was 53, a veteran of the First World War who'd spent the interwar years arguing, often futilely, for armored doctrine. Now his theories were vindicated in blood and steel. "Sir, after-action reports are coming in." His aide, Captain Sarah Westbrook, handed him a folder thick with preliminary assessments. Sarah was one of only a dozen women this close to the front lines, a logistics officer whose organizational genius had helped plan the tank landings. Miller read in silence. The numbers told a story. Beaches assaulted, obstacles cleared, defenses penetrated. But between the numbers were the names, hundreds of them, thousands. Men who would never see Pennsylvania or Texas or California again. "The D.D. Shermans?" he asked quietly. "Mixed results, sir. Several sank in the rough seas. But those that made it to shore, the Germans were completely unprepared. Their defensive fire was directed at infantry positions. By the time they realized we had armor on the beach, we'd already breached their primary defensive line." Miller nodded slowly. He'd fought against this plan initially, thought it too risky. Tanks were precious, each one representing thousands of man-hours of production, hundreds of tons of steel. The idea of swimming them to shore on inflatable canvas screens had seemed like madness. But Major General Percy Hobart, the eccentric British officer who'd designed the specialized armor, had been right. Sometimes madness was what won wars. What about the regular LSTs? The ones that beached? Even better, sir. Once we established that we could land tanks directly on the beach, we brought in waves of Shermans. The Germans' beach obstacles were designed for infantry landing craft, not for LSTs. We simply drove over or around them. Through the bunker's firing slit, Miller could see more tanks rolling inland, their exhausted crews replaced by fresh units. The logistics of this operation staggered the mind, thousands of ships, hundreds of thousands of men, all coordinated to strike a single 50-mile stretch of coastline. A commotion at the bunker entrance made him turn. Two soldiers were escorting a German officer, an Oberst equivalent to a colonel, his uniform immaculate despite the chaos. The German's face was a mask of shock and disbelief. "General Miller," the translator said, "this is Oberst Klaus Richter, formerly in command of the 352nd Infantry Division's defensive sector. He wishes to speak with you. Miller studied German. Richter was perhaps 40, with the weathered face of a professional soldier. He'd probably fought in Russia, had probably seen things that would haunt him forever. Now he'd seen his carefully prepared defenses torn apart in a single day. What does he want? Miller asked. The translator spoke in rapid German. Richter responded, his voice controlled but strained. He wants to know how we did it, sir. How we got armor onto the beaches. He says it was supposed to be impossible. He says. The translator paused, listening. He says his superiors assured him that tanks could not be landed directly from ships, that we would need to capture a port first. He wants to know why his intelligence was so wrong. Miller almost smiled. Almost. There were too many dead men to smile at. Tell the Oberst that sometimes the impossible is simply the thing no one has tried yet. As the translator relayed this, Richter's expression shifted. From shock to something that might have been respect, might have been despair. He spoke again, more quietly this time. He says this is the beginning of the end. If America can land tanks on open beaches, there is nowhere Germany can defend. He says the Führer has led them to ruin. Take him to the prisoner-holding area, Miller ordered. Treat him with respect. The war may not be over for him, but his part in it is. After Richter was led away, Miller returned to his maps. Sarah Westbrook stood beside him, pointing to various locations marked with colored pins. Sir, if I may, what we've done here, it changes everything. Not just for this war, but for future conflicts. We've proven that a prepared beach defense can be overcome with sufficient firepower and the right equipment. You're right, Captain, but I hope to God there are never any future conflicts that require this level of sacrifice. Miller touched one of the pins marking a casualty collection point. Every man who died today died so that this plan, this impossible, insane plan, might work. They died so that tanks could swim and steel could float and the Atlantic Wall could be breached. They died to free Europe, sir. Yes, Miller agreed softly. They died to free Europe. 3 weeks after D-Day, Lieutenant James Holloway sat on the turret of his Sherman tank, now christened Pittsburgh Steel by its crew, and wrote a letter home. The tank bore scars from a dozen engagements, pockmarks from machine gun fire, a long gouge where a Panzer shell had deflected off the turret, burns from a Panzerfaust that had malfunctioned. Dear Sarah and Tommy, I'm writing this from somewhere in France. I can't tell you exactly where, but it's a beautiful country. Green fields, stone farmhouses, churches that have stood for 1,000 years. It's hard to believe that so much blood was spilled here just a few weeks ago. I want you to know that I'm safe. We've had some close calls, but our crew is still intact. Sergeant Tucker says it's because we're either very lucky or very good. I think it's a bit of both, plus we have 30 tons of American steel protecting us. Tommy, your daddy rode a tank right onto a beach where the Germans said tanks couldn't go. We surprised them. Sometimes that's all it takes, doing what the enemy thinks is impossible. Remember that. When life tells you something can't be done, sometimes you just have to try anyway. Sarah, I think about you every day. I think about our backyard, about Tommy's wooden sword, about the way you laugh. Those memories are what keep me going when things get hard. And they do get hard. But we're winning. Every day we push a little further. Every day we get a little closer to ending this war and coming home. Around him, the Norman countryside was transforming. Engineer battalions were clearing obstacles, repairing roads, and building the infrastructure needed to support an army. The Mulberry harbors, artificial ports assembled from concrete and steel, were being towed across the channel, allowing supplies to pour in without needing to capture a major port city. The Germans had planned for the Allies to be thrown back into the sea, or at best, to be bottled up on the beaches for weeks while reinforcements arrived. Instead, the Allies were already breaking out, tank columns racing inland, liberating villages that had lived under occupation for 4 years. Raymond Chin climbed up beside James. Lieutenant, we just got word. Cherbourg is under siege. They think it'll fall within days. Once we have a major port, there'll be no stopping us. James nodded. Cherbourg was supposed to be impregnable, its harbor fortifications rivaling anything on the Atlantic Wall. But once armor was inland, once the impossible had been achieved, every other obstacle seemed suddenly surmountable. "Ray, do you ever think about what happens after?" James asked. "After the war?" Raymond stared at the horizon. "I think about my family, about whether my parents are still in that camp, or if they've been released. I think about going back to San Francisco and opening a garage, working on cars instead of tanks. I think about—" He trailed off. "About what?" "About whether America will accept me. I'm fighting for a country that locks up people who look like me without trial. But it's still my country, Lieutenant. Still worth fighting for. Still worth dying for, if it comes to that." James didn't know what to say to that. The contradictions of America, its lofty ideals and its ugly realities, were too large for easy answers. All he knew was that Raymond was the best damn tank driver in the army, and that when the shooting started, nationality and race didn't matter as much as training and courage. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Eddie Martinez emerged from the tank's belly, grease-stained and grinning. "She's running like a dream, Lieutenant." Raymond barely scratched the transmission during that last run-in with the Panzers. "The kid's got magic in his fingers." "Just good training, Eddie." "Training and talent," Eddie corrected. He pulled out a pack of cigarettes, offered them around. "You know what I heard? I heard they're already planning the next invasion. Southern France, Italy, maybe even directly into Germany. And every plan involves tanks. Lots of tanks. Because they work," James said simply. "Because on June 6th we proved that armor can go anywhere and can break any defense. The Germans thought they had an impregnable wall. We drove right through it." That evening, as the sun set over Normandy in shades of orange and purple that seemed obscene in their beauty, James finished his letter. "We did something here that changed the war. I'm not a general or a strategist, so I can't explain all the implications. But I know that before D-Day, everyone said we couldn't land tanks on defended beaches. Now everyone knows we can. And that changes everything. I'll be home as soon as I can. Until then, know that I love you both more than words can say. Give Tommy a hug from his daddy. Tell him his father rides an iron horse into battle, and that horse is bringing freedom to people who've forgotten what it feels like. All my love, James." He folded the letter, addressed it, and left it for the mail courier. Tomorrow they will push forward again. The battle for Normandy was far from over. The hedgerow fighting would last months, and would cost tens of thousands of lives. But the outcome was no longer in doubt. The Allies were in France to stay, and with them came an unstoppable tide of steel. The Germans had never expected tanks on the beaches. That single miscalculation, that failure of imagination, had cost them everything. The Atlantic Wall was broken. The road to Berlin was open. And leading the way were the tanks, the impossible tanks, the swimming tanks, the tanks that changed warfare forever. 75 years later, an old man stood on Omaha Beach, his granddaughter beside him. James Holloway was 96 now, stooped with age, but his eyes were still sharp as he looked out at the water where bodies had once floated. "The channel is calm today," he said. "It wasn't calm on June 6, 1944. His granddaughter, Emma, a history teacher from Philadelphia, held his arm gently. "Tell me again, Grandpa. Tell me about the tanks." James smiled. He'd told this story 1,000 times, to his children, his grandchildren, to school groups and historians. But he never tired of telling it, because it was the most important thing he'd ever done. "The Germans never expected us to land tanks on these beaches," he began. "They thought it was impossible. They were wrong." He pointed to the water, where landing craft had once disgorged thousands of men into hell. "We came in on LSTs, landing ship tanks, designed to beach themselves and drop their ramps. Out came the Shermans, 30 tons of armor that the Germans weren't prepared for. We drove right through their obstacles, up onto the sand, and we didn't stop until we'd broken their defensive line." Emma had heard the story before, but she listened as if it were new. That was her gift, making the old feel heard. "And you were there, in a tank," Pittsburgh Steel, James confirmed. Best tank crew in the Army. Sergeant Tucker, Raymond Chun, Eddie Martinez, Johnny Fitzgerald, and Frank Morrison. Tucker died in '98. Raymond in 2005. Eddie just last year. Johnny and Frank are still around, though Frank's in a care facility in Arizona. Can't remember much anymore. But you remember. I remember everything, James said quietly. I remember the sound of shells hitting water, the smell of cordite and salt and fear. I remember German boys not much older than Tommy shooting at us, and us shooting back. I remember being terrified and exhilarated and certain I was going to die. They walked along the beach, now peaceful and marked with memorials. Tourists took selfies near the monuments. Children played in the surf. It was right, James thought. It was what they'd fought for, the right for future generations to live without fear, to play on beaches without worrying about machine gun fire. The German officer we captured, Emma said. Oberst Richter. What happened to him? He survived the war, went back to Germany. Became a schoolteacher, actually. Spent the rest of his life teaching children about the dangers of fascism. He wrote a book about his experiences, about how the failure to anticipate Allied tactics cost Germany the war. He and I corresponded for years before he died. Strange, isn't it? Becoming friends with someone who once tried to kill you. That's what peace looks like, Emma said. They reached the American cemetery, where row upon row of white crosses stretched toward the horizon. 9,387 of them, each marking a life cut short. James found one particular cross and stood before it in silence. PFC Thomas Holloway, Pennsylvania, June 6, 1944. My brother, James said, his voice breaking even after all these years. He landed on this beach 2 hours before I did. Infantry, 29th Division. He made it 50 yards inland before a machine gun cut him down. Emma had known about her great-uncle and had seen his medals displayed in James's study. But standing here, seeing his name carved in stone, made it real in a way photographs never could. I named Tommy after him, James continued. Your grandfather. I wanted someone to carry his name forward, to ensure he wasn't forgotten. Tommy never got to ride a tank or see Paris liberated or go home to Pennsylvania. He died in the surf, fighting for a beach he'd never heard of in a country he'd never visited. And the world is better because he did. They stood in silence for a long moment. Finally, Emma asked, Do you regret it? The war, the killing, everything you had to do? James considered the question carefully. I regret that it was necessary. I regret every life lost, every family destroyed, every child who grew up without a father. But I don't regret fighting. Evil exists in the world, Emma. Real evil, not just people we disagree with. And sometimes the only way to stop evil is to stand against it, even if the cost is terrible. They left the cemetery as the sun began to set, painting the channel the same colors James remembered from 1944. As they walked back to their rental car, Emma asked one more question. What do you want people to remember about D-Day? James stopped, looking back at the beach one last time. I want them to remember that the impossible is possible. That when humanity is at its best, when we work together toward a common purpose, we can overcome any obstacle. The Germans thought tanks couldn't land on beaches. We proved them wrong. And that one impossibility, that one innovation, changed the course of human history. That's what I tell my students, Emma said. That history isn't inevitable. It's made by people making choices, taking risks, trying things no one has tried before. Good, James said. Then my brother didn't die for nothing. Then none of them died for nothing. As they drove away from Omaha Beach, James looked back one more time. In his mind's eye, he could still see Pittsburgh Steel roaring up the sand, could still hear Tucker shouting orders, could still feel the adrenaline and terror of that impossible day when tanks swam to shore and changed the world. The iron tide had broken the Atlantic wall, and the waves it set in motion were still rippling through history, still shaping the world his great-granddaughter would inherit. Some legacies lasted forever.